Hello my quilting friends! Leah Day here with a new video for the Machine Quilting Block Party. Today we're piecing our diamond Dresden plate. It's a 12-petal Dresden with pointy petals that are very easy to piece. So let's get started first learning how to cut our petals and piece them together. The first step to creating this Dresden plate is to cut out your petal shapes, and these are going to be tumbler shapes that we're going to turn into a pointy petal. So print out page 6 of your quilt pattern and use a ruler to double check that that 1-inch box measures exactly 1 inch. It shouldn't measure anything smaller or bigger, 1 inch exactly. So I take this and double it with freezer paper, and you can cut out your shapes that way. I have another video on cutting out your shapes, so definitely check that out. An alternative, if you don't want to bother making a paper template, you can also pick up the Dresden plate template set, and we're using template number 3, which will allow you to cut really nice tumbler shapes very, very accurately. So you're going to need a total of 6 fabric A and 6 fabric C tumblers. And now we're going to take them and fold them in half. You want to fold it in half, right sides together. And just give that a little crease. I like to take my iron and press it once I'm sure that those sides are nicely lined up. I like to take my iron and press it. We're going to take this to the machine and stitch along this wider edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to slide that petal shape right up against the needle. I have stitched through a scrap charger and then off the edge, that way I could just get started right on the edge of my piece. I'm going to take a few stitches and then back stitch. And I'm starting with the fold going first, so that way I know it's folded nicely and those edges are going to come in nice alignment at the end. I'll grab my next piece, and you can just chain piece through all of these all in one go. So just a few stitches on. And what that does is that reinforces the tip of your Dresden plate petal so the stitches don't come out. And now we'll turn them out to turn them into pointy petals. So I want to trim away this tip just because it can build up a little too much fabric in that area and not turn out nicely. So I just trim that off slightly and then open it out and finger press that seam allowance open. I usually just stick a finger in it and then run my fingernail across the top, and that works out well. Then just take it and turn it inside out, just like that. And you can kind of poke at it. Usually if you hold your scissors together and the point's not too pointy, you can use the tip of your scissors to poke at that and get a nice sharp point. So that looks good. Now I'm going to set it down on my pressing board, and I have this center line that where I creased the petal in half, and I want to line up the seam line so it's centered right on that crease line. And that's just stopping it from kind of being asymmetrical and winging out and doing something weird. That would be a cool idea for another Dresden plate, but for this one I want a nice symmetrical petal shape. So I'm going to give it another press, and there we go. It creates a perfect Dresden plate petal. So go on ahead and turn all of the tips to create your pointy petals, and now we're going to piece them together in sets of 3. 3 petals will create a 1/4 of your Dresden plate shape, and that's going to enable us to square it up and make it really accurate. So I'm going to take one petal, flip it over the other, we're going to take it to the machine and stitch this seam together. Here at the machine, I'm just making sure that those 2 petals are in perfect alignment and that the outer edges where the petals fold over are in nice alignment. I'm going to take a few stitches on, and then I'm going to back stitch. And that's just making sure that those petals don't come undone right along the outer edge. And then stitch on down. And I'm just making sure that the edges of the fabrics don't slip out from underneath that foot. They stay nice alignment with my presser foot all the way down. So I'll sew onto a scrap charger. This just keeps my thread tails organized. It stops the threads from kind of gagging when you first start stitching. And that way I can just keep on stitching. It's kind of like it keeps the machine still in stitching mode. I'm going to grab my other petal shape and line it up too. And we're going to just do the exact same thing. I'm going to stitch off that scrap charger and onto these petals. A few stitches forward, a few stitches back to secure it, and then stitch on down, nice, accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you get your petals pieced together, use your fingernail to open up that seam line. You want to flatten it out completely. I'm able to do this because I piece with a really short stitch length. I lower my stitch length to 1.5 millimeters, and that produces a nice secure stitch. So I feel comfortable opening up those seam lines so that the Dresden plate's going to finish nice and flat. So that is 1/4 of our Dresden plate pieced. Now let's learn how to square this up so it pieces together perfectly. So now I'm squaring up my 1/4 Dresden plate shape. So this is a nice 90-degree angle. I'm lining up a 45-degree line right through the center of that center petal, and then I'm just trimming off those sides. It's honestly not that much, just a little bit of fuzz. And I have this rotating mat, so I'm able to rotate it. I only have to position my ruler one time, and I can rotate and make those cuts. So it's very little to trim. You could probably skip that step, but I like to do it just to ensure that all of these petal shapes, all of these 1/4 plate shapes are going to come together just exactly right. So now let's lay out our block and start planning how it's going to go together. So here's our plate arranged, and the next step is to piece it together to create the 2 halves. And you want to always piece from the outside to the inside. It gives you a chance to back stitch right here, and it also gives you an opportunity to make sure that the outer edge is going to be in perfect alignment. It doesn't really matter what happens to the inside because we're going to be covering that up with a center circle. So always piece from the outside to the inside as you stitch these 4 seams. So here's my finished Dresden plate, and I'm just giving it a final press on the back side. And I've already pieced together my quilt background, and you can find instructions on piecing this in your quilt pattern. So I pressed this in half so I have a crease line running horizontally and vertically so I can easily line up this Dresden plate. Now you can do this 2 different ways. You could line it up so that the points are lined up along those lines and centered that way. That looks really cute. But the way I wrote it in the pattern is to do it like this so that you have the V's, the seam lines, lining up with those straight lines through the middle. Just like that. I just kind of give it a little smooth out. Make sure it's nice and flat. And now there are a lot of different ways that you can secure this down to the background. You could pen it. You could hand stitch it, you know, any of those things are open to you. My favorite thing is to glue it in place. And the reason I like glue is it holds in place firmly. It's not going to come out while I'm stitching on it or quilting on it. But once I finish and wash the block, it's going to rinse out completely. So I'm applying this glue, and this is just Elmer's glue, and I put it in this small glue bottle with this fine tip, and that just helps me control it. You don't want a lot of it on your block. You want to be able to control it and only put on just the minimum amount that you need to hold the block in place. So now I'm going to smooth it out, make sure it's in the right location here. And then it's Elmer's glue. It's going to dry really quickly if you press it with a hot iron. So that's how I'm going to work around the block, just gluing those petals down. And I'm going to do the exact same thing for the center circle. You can find another video on how to turn the edges of this center circle perfectly using freezer paper. So definitely check out that video. I'm just going to fold this in half to crease it, find the center point, and line it up and glue it into place just the exact same way. The last step is to secure the edges of your appliques to the background with some form of stitching. You can do this by hand, and I have another video on that, but I'm going to do this by machine. It's just a little bit faster. And for this block, I've decided to use a zigzag stitch. So I used a scrap of fabric here and played with the length and width of my stitch until I came up with a zigzag that I thought looked nice. Definitely take the time to do this test off the block so you don't have to rip it out. So this is a really tiny zigzag. I think my stitch width is at 1.5 millimeters and my stitch length is at 0.75 millimeters. So it's really small. I am using green thread, which is contrasting with my purple fabric, but I think that's okay. Whenever I reach a point, I'm going to just use the hand wheel to rotate and drop that needle down exactly where I want it to go. So the only thing tricky about stitching with a zigzag is just where it changes directions, just those inside and outside points. And as you can see, that wasn't that much of a time-consuming hassle to just sit there and turn the hand wheel and get it in a position. And I found most of the time for these inside points, I could just kind of wing it, and usually it would work out okay. I find that another way that you can stitch this really fast and quickly is with just a straight stitch, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the applique. That works good too. That's a little faster because, of course, your turns, these points are a little bit easier to handle, a little bit faster to speed around. But sometimes you just really like a nice decorative finish, and a zigzag's, just it adds a little extra texture to the edge of your applique, and that looks nice too. So I'm going to do the exact same thing, stitching around my center circle as well. And here's what it looks like whenever you finish this beautiful Dresden plate block. So that's it for this video. If you're looking for the quilt pattern, including the template, so that way you can piece your Dresden plate petals, you can find it at leahday.com/blockparty. You know, the name of this Dresden plate actually comes from the quilting design, and we're going to be learning how to quilt it together next. So make sure to be looking for that new video coming out soon. Until next time, let's go quilt.